and it didn't take me too long to figure out that there's not really any such thing as free trade, at least on the global scale, because other countries have tariffs, they have regulations that block people out. I mean, in China, at the time I was over there doing joint ventures and partnerships, we could only own 49% of any entity that we had over there. So the Chinese always had controlling shares and everything. But through all of that, I've had the opportunity to work with some amazing people over my career. And I've experienced hundreds of different cultures, pretty much every race on the face of the earth. I've worked with, worked for, or hired to work with me. And I told him, I said, the only thing I can tell you is be ready for the next opportunity. Whatever it takes, whatever you think you want to do as much to get prepared for it as you possibly can, because those opportunities are rare. And once they come along, if you miss them, you may not get another chance to do it.
I'm honored today to have with us Michael Smith. He's a writer of great interest and I want to say prolific. I was almost going to say profligacy. There's a fair amount of prophecy. And before I kind of stumble my way into any more verbal gaffes, I'm going to let Michael take it away. I enjoy reading his stuff. He's got a blog, Substack called Unlicensed Punditry, and I assume he's going to get his license soon because he's been doing a fair amount of it, and a very interesting read, generally speaking. And he's a fluid writer, and I've known his writing for a fair amount of time, but have not yet had the honor of sitting down and chatting with him, which we're going to do today. So thank you, Michael, for coming on. Tell us a little bit, the Michael Smith origin story and why you're doing
Sure.
what you're doing and what you hope to accomplish.
No, happy to do it, Randy. As you said, you've been reading me for a while, but I actually started writing in publishing in about 2006. So I'm kind of a 20-year overnight success, more or less. I have had a extraordinary career. And I mean, you can probably tell, your listeners are probably, and viewers are probably going to notice that my accent is definitely from the south of the Mason-Dixon line. But I grew up in North Mississippi, and I grew up on a farm in North Mississippi, a family farm. I've worked ever since I was 10 years old. But I've had a career that if I could have mapped it out, I would never have expected anything like what I've had. As I said, I grew up on a farm. I went to college. I worked my way through school. I got a degree. I've got a degree in mechanical engineering and a degree in finance. I've got my MBA from the University of Utah. But I have been blessed to be in positions to where I can experience the world. I have been to 87 countries at the last count, done business and or lived abroad. I basically spent 3 years in and out of China when China was actually getting hot back in the early 2000s. I spent 3 years, my wife and I lived in Scotland and in Edinburgh for 3 years. So I ran a North Sea oil and gas business. Industry-wide, I've been in aerospace, I've been in automotive, but for about the last 20 or 25 years or so, I've been in energy. I've been primarily in oil and gas exploration and production. But through all of that, I've had the opportunity to work with some amazing people over my career. And I've experienced hundreds of different cultures, pretty much every race on the face of the earth. I've worked with, worked for, or hired to work with me. So I've got a pretty unique perspective of what the whole global situation looks like. I actually was a globalist when I first got started out because I believed in free trade and really kind of America's worldwide reach. And it didn't take me too long to figure out that there's not really any such thing as free trade, at least on the global scale, because other countries have tariffs, they have regulations that block people out. I mean, in China, at the time I was over there doing joint ventures and partnerships, we could only own 49% of any entity that we had over there. So the Chinese always had controlling shares and everything. But I've been interested in writing and interested in politics and pretty much everything from that standpoint for a very long time. I had if anybody's to take credit or to blame for what I am and what I do, it's probably my senior English teacher in high school, because she was my best friend's mom. My best friend was the quarterback of our high school football team, and she was our senior English teacher, and she taught me. She recognized something in me, even at that young, that I had a gift for accumulating and retaining information, I guess, if you would, the best way to describe it. I've read pretty much. I love reading, and I picked up and read pretty much everything that you can get that I could get my hands on, and it gives me. I wanted to have a broad perspective of the world and my career. I was once asked by a young engineer, and when I was running a facility or running a business in Scotland, he asked me, "Well, how did you get where you are, and how did you prepare to get there?" And I said, "I really didn't have a career map. I didn't map this out. I'd been crazy to think some kid from the red clay hills of North Mississippi was ever going to be, working and managing a 700 person business in Scotland." And I told him, I said, the only thing I can tell you is be ready for the next opportunity. Whatever it takes, whatever you think you want to do as much to get prepared for it as you possibly can, because those opportunities are rare, and once they come along, if you miss them, you may not get another chance to do it. So that's really kind of how I've lived my life. I grew up. I just wrote a piece about a little bit about my background, and people ask me, "Well, how did you come to be a conservative?" And my answer is I really didn't learn to be a conservative. I really didn't adopt it as an ideology or a philosophy. It's the way I grew up. I mean, I grew up on a farm. You're very close to the cold face of reality when you're growing up on a farm. So you get a perspective of life that is pretty close to natural law, and I learned from that, and I've used those principles and those values in my life as I've spent almost 6 and 3/4 decades on this planet, and it's served me very well. And it's something that we did, and I'd even said in the piece, I didn't really understand that other people didn't live the way that I lived, because I'd never experienced anything other than where I grew up in a small town in North Mississippi. So I wanted to get my views and my message out to other people. And really, I've said this before, my real goal is that I want to let other people know that they're not the only ones thinking the way that they're thinking. And I help do that. I help facilitate that thinking process. And I try to teach people. I try to let them learn something from my experiences and from the things that I write. So, and I just love doing it. I've packed so much in my head over the past 60 some odd years that these ideas come to me. I've had these random things that I'll do or notice or see over time. And then all of a sudden, I'll sit down in front of the computer, or I'll be at breakfast or have a cup of coffee or whatever. And all of a sudden, these ideas start to make sense and they start to come together. And that's really the genesis of my writing. And up until, say, about a year ago, it was mostly stream of consciousness stuff. I would sit down in front of the keyboard and bang it out. But I have actually started to um, get into a role where I'm actually spending more time doing research and reading before I actually start to write, so that I can actually do a better job. I feel like I have a responsibility I've got 34,000 followers on Facebook now, and I've got over 5,000 people on my Substack. And all of this has really happened within the last year or so. I wrote a piece called America at 250, crisis of civic memory, civic memory, back around Thanksgiving last year. And all of a sudden, I went from that one post went. I mean, it went crazy. It went from the time I posted it, 24 hours later, it already had 750,000 views, and it just launched into the stratosphere, and it got me noticed. And now all of a sudden, I've got, and I'm picking up about 500 followers a day right now. So it's just, I mean, it's snowballing. But I take that responsibility very seriously, because my bond with the reader is to be honest with them. So I give them my honest view. It may be right, it may be wrong, but you're going to get the unvarnished me. But Current events interest me, but I always try to write about current events with a philosophical twist because I learned a lot at the knee of my grandfather. My grandfather had the equivalent of about an eighth grade education, but he's formal education. But he read the classics. He read anything he could get his hands on. He served on the school board. He built one of the first schools in the community that I lived in back in the 1930s, and I learned so much from him and his wisdom. He was undoubtedly the wisest man I've ever encountered, and he had the least amount of formal education of probably anybody that I've ever talked to. But he taught me the value of knowledge. He taught me the value of truth. He taught me the value of honesty. Um, I don't. The guy was a major farmer in North Mississippi, and I don't think he ever signed a paper contract in his entire life. It was his word was his bond, and his handshake was his bond. And he never, he told me one time. He said, the only thing that you've really got, no matter what you have, is your reputation. He said you should never do anything to damage it. And I've followed that path my entire life too. But no, I tackle any, you've seen my writing. I tackle any subject. I'll go from philosophy to economics to business to personal items of things that I think are valuable to the readers. And I just really have a great time doing it. My wife likes to say that I have um, ideological Tourette syndrome, that I can't shut up. It just all of a sudden comes out when I sit down. But and some of that's kind of true. I'll get an idea in my head, and I can't rest with that until I've actually committed it to get it organized in my head and actually committed it to something that people can go read and they can understand. And I get wordy sometimes. I mean, people complain about some of my posts being long, but I just posted this morning because I had a couple of complaints about it. I said, guys, look, I mean, 850 words, it takes an average reader about 4 minutes to read that. If you don't have 4 minutes out of your day to read this, then you probably shouldn't read it at all. And not being confrontational, but we get into such an instant gratification phase these days that you expect all these hits on cable news to take. You look at these things that are like 20 seconds or 30 seconds long. I mean, you can't learn anything in 20 or 30 seconds. I mean, I told somebody this morning, I could say, well, progressivism sucks, end of story. I could do that on every one of the posts, but it wouldn't be very interesting. So I try to make it interesting. I try to make people want to read what I write. And I think I finally found that groove. Like I said, within the last, 4 or 5 months, I've gone from about, oh, I don't know, Facebook changed me over to what they call a digital creator. So I don't really have friends on Facebook anymore. Um, but I had maxed out at 5,000 friends that I had accepted, and I can still accept friends. I'm still limited by at that 5,000 limit, but all of a sudden my followers just absolutely exploded. And I've got a waiting list on my friend request of 40. No, actually, it's up to a year now. I've got people out there that have been waiting for a year for me to accept their friend requests. And I've got, I think at last count, I had over 700 people on that list of people that have sent me friend requests. I mean, they've actually become followers, but with being the friend category actually gets you a little bit early access to things when they're posted and all this kind of stuff. But no, I'm just blessed to be where I am. I'm kind of gliding into retirement now, and sort of in a really kind of an unusual, unplanned event. My wife actually started a publishing business last year. She's leveraging her 36 years of experience as a school teacher and a reading specialist. She really wanted to focus on helping children learn to read. And part people may have heard of the Mississippi Miracle that's happened over the last, but certainly hasn't happened overnight, because my wife was involved in this before we moved away from Mississippi, about trying to build up the reading skills of the kids in the Mississippi schools. And Mississippi has one of the highest reading comprehension scores now for their high school kids of any state in the union. And that, when I went to school there, I am a victim of the Mississippi public school system. But we fought with Louisiana and Alabama and Arkansas for last place in all the educational scores when I was in school. But I had, I say that in pure jest because I had some of the best teachers that you could ever have. I mean, but then, 60 years ago, teachers cared about the students. They weren't They weren't trying to teach them how to protest. They were trying to build them into good people. And it, I mean, all that added up to where I am right now. And like I said, both my wife and I are kind of in the language and word business now. And I'm still doing management consulting and a few other things. I've got a couple of projects going on, but I'm gradually gliding toward retirement right now. And I really wanted something that I could continue to do in retirement that it was mentally challenging. And we tried to retire several years ago. She and I both did, and we took off for, we sold the company. We took off for a couple of years, and I just felt stale. I mean, I really did. I mean, we traveled a good bit, we read a good bit, but there's only so many places you can go and so many books you can read until you get to a point where you're sitting around and you're really thinking, well, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? I mean, I'm going to live another 30 or 40 years, God willing. And what am I going to do with it? And I think this is important, and I think it's probably one of the most critical times in my life to get messages out and have people heard and have people hear you, because there's a lot of confusion in society right now. I mean, we have manufactured more chaos in the past 4 or 5 years. Well, actually, probably the past 10 years than I've ever seen in my entire life. And I grew up during the 60s. I mean, I remember the riots. I remember the Vietnam War. I mean, I was a kid in school, but I can remember going home every night, and the first thing you heard on every news broadcast on the evening news was the body count. How many people were killed? And my uncles, several of my uncles were draft age, and I've had three of my uncles actually went to Vietnam. All of them came back okay, but it the chaos now in some ways mimics that chaos of the late 60s, but there's an element of unseriousness about the chaos that we have today. And that's the reason I use the term manufactured chaos, because it really does feel like it's just it's chaos for chaos sake. There's really no real purpose behind it. And I attack that every day. I mean, I work through those situations every day and try to give people the facts based on my perspective. And I'm always interested in, one of the caveats in anything that I ever write is, if you think I'm wrong, you've got an open forum to come back and tell me why I'm wrong. And I've invited people, hey, you don't like what I write, take it, do a counterpoint on it, and send it back to me. I'll publish it. I want to know. I want to hear those voices. So anyhow, that's me. I'm just a regular dude. I mean, I'm nothing special. I've just had a great opportunity to have a lot of experiences. I've learned a lot along the way. And now I'm in a position to actually share that information and share those positions. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do. I'm certainly not going to get rich at it.
Working.
So,
Well, we'll see about that.
Well, I appreciate that.
I mean, Substack
I hope so.
Yeah, no, you should make money. Samuel Johnson said, anybody who writes not for money is anybody who writes not for money is a fool, or something like that. It's kind of the standard. You go to the restaurant, and your server. It's like I'm actually an actress, but I'll be your waitress tonight. Like, no, actually, at this point, you're a waitress. When you're an actress, I'll see you on stage. So when you get paid for something, that's a validation. Plus, the magnitude of validation. People think that other people get money through theft, and I think the economy, 1.0 was a rape pillage economy back, say, a couple thousand years ago. In order to get something, you have to storm someplace and get some other people's stuff.
Right.
But the economy 2.0 is much more. If people like your stuff, they give you money. Bill Gates. Yeah. I don't agree with him on everything, but Windows was a great leveler for information, and people
Absolutely.
volunteered their money to a certain extent. And obviously, there's some monopoly kind of duopoly aspects to it with Apple and whatnot. But people are giving their money. They're giving their money to NVIDIA. They're giving their money to things they want and need. So if they give their money to you for your opinions, that doesn't mean it's any less valuable. If Bill Gates made money on Windows and you make money on Windows to the world and Windows to philosophy and Windows of thought and Windows through which people can exit their contemplative phase to something better, then your Windows should make money just like his did.
Yeah. No, understood. And my wife and daughter actually convinced me of that about a year ago. And they said, you really should be, your stuff's pretty good. He said, you really should be monetizing it. And I've been working on kind of a digital presence. I've got quite a few things going on right now. I've got the Substack. I've got the stuff that's going on Facebook. I've got a digital product that I brought out. The first edition was in January, called the American Pamphleteer. And what I wanted to do with that is, we had my management team, which is my daughter's my digital services advisor. She's got a law degree, but she works for a software company, so she's been doing a lot of my digital presence development. And my wife has obviously got the publishing background. So we were talking through this, and she said, the things that you write are worth people paying for, but they're also valuable because you say you're not, but you're kind of a teacher. And so what we decided to do is we wanted to put together a product that I could deliver once a month that's actually limited in scope, that we would select. And we did this. We sat down and we went through the entire year and we broke it down by month, and we picked 4 topics each month to be addressed. And what I'm trying to get into people's minds is, how do I, if I'm a conservative, I don't like to call myself a conservative because that's kind of a recent development as far as the ideology goes. I'm more of a classical liberal. And we've perverted the term liberal in the U.S. because liberal now means somebody on the left. You live in the UK for a while, you find out liberal is not somebody that lives on the left. I mean, they're actually conservative, U.S. conservatives, more or less. So classical liberalism is basically, if you think of people who really um, are fit that mold as far as classical liberalism, it's more people like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and Ben Franklin, and basically the founders were more or less classical liberals before we even developed that term. But I wanted to be able to help people have conversations because I think people live their lives a lot more conservatively than their politics. I mean, I know a lot of Democrats and a lot of friends who I have, believe it or not, I have friends who are progressives, but I know them personally, and I know that they live their life and they manage their household in a manner that's a lot more capitalistic and a lot more conservative than their politics would let you believe. So I know there's a group of people out there that I wanted to try to reach to help them understand, to have conversations with people who are on the other side of the aisle and not screaming and yelling and throwing coffee cups and that kind of stuff, but be able to sit down and have an honest conversation with them. But some people I've run into don't know the language. They don't really know how to have that conversation. So what we've done is we've taken basically 48 issues, separate, things like the economy, voting rights, Second Amendment, those kind of things. And we've broken those up, and I'm addressing those each month. And what I do is I give people what we're calling a practicum, which is basically the way to discuss this and the language to use and the things to watch out for. And then I back that up by doing what I'm calling, there's 2 sections to the pamphlet, and we call it a deeper dive. And what it is those 4 issues exploded into, anywhere from 800 to 1,500 words of explanation of why what information you need to back up your conversation. So we're doing that, and I've got the first edition came out on the third Friday of January. The next one's due coming out next week in February, and it's been pretty well received. I mean, I offered annual subscriptions or monthly subscriptions to it, and I've had pretty good response to it. So we're actually rolling those kind of things out and got that part of it going. But believe it or not, I grew up in a construction family too. So I'm even on TikTok now. I'm doing a series of TikTok home improvement suggestions and how to do things. Simple things like how to replace a faucet. There's a lot of people out there who need that kind of information that can save them money. That it's not that hard to do. It's not, major construction, but I have that expertise to be able to teach people to do that. I've been a woodworker all my life. I grew up building houses with my dad, and so I've gone through that whole process too. So I'm sharing that. So basically, I'm moving out of the manufacturing world and into sort of the digital world now, I'm on this downslope into retirement. And I swear to goodness, it looks like I'm going to be busier in retirement than I was when I was actually working at a supposedly a 40-hour job. They never turned out that way. But no, it's all kind of related because it's all about teaching. It's all about helping people understand things. And that's really, if I distill what I do down to a tablet size level, it would be, helping people understand things. I mean, and again, I'm giving my perspective, but I'm always open to people engaging with me to have that discussion. And I learn things. I mean, one of the things I've told people that on Facebook and on Substack both is I enjoy your comments. I try to read every single one of them. Now, if I get a post that's got 1,500 comments on it or something like that, I'm not going to be able to read them all. But I'll scan through them and try to find the most important ones that I think are most important, and I'll read them. And I usually respond directly to the person that left the comment because I'm interested. I want to understand what they're thinking about. But it's an interactive, kind of an interactive thing. But again, from the writing perspective, I have these ideas that just come to me. It's current events, it's philosophy, but my background has given me a broad enough education that if I see an event that happens today, typically I can relate it to some philosophical concept or some economic concept or something like that, and then bring that concept forward to help people understand why things are happening the way they're happening. I mean, I had one post this morning too about economics because people are yelling and screaming about affordability, affordability, affordability. Well, yeah, I understand that, but we just jacked up an entire supply chain that's multiple steps until you see that product on your table. And there's no magic knob that you can reach in and turn on the economy to bring the prices down, because costs have to go down along each level of that value chain to allow that retail price to go down. That retail price is actually the hardest thing to change of anything in the value chain. And you got to understand that from raw material all the way to the time it hits your house, there's cost being added to it. There's value being added to it too, but there's cost being added to it. So you can't go to Walmart and say, milk is $4 a gallon. I need that to be $1.50 a gallon, and just turn some knob and it happens. Some poor cow somewhere out in the middle of the pasture somewhere is working their cow rear end off trying to get that milk to you, and it costs what it costs to make that happen. That cow's got to eat something. That cow's got to be treated. It's got to be kept healthy. It's got to have a barn to live in. I mean, all this kind of stuff factors into that cost of that gallon of milk that's sitting on your table at night. And people have to understand that it's easy to jack prices up, but it's a real tough thing to get them to go back down again. And we don't really want them to go down because people don't understand deflation. Deflation sounds great in concept, but in reality, it's a disaster. If prices go down too fast, then you wind up with some serious, serious economic issues. But I'm sorry, I'm rattling on now, but that's, in a nutshell, that's me. I'm trying to help people understand the world and I've had the opportunity to see a lot of it and meet a lot of people and understand the different perspectives. I've I've hired people from the Balkans. I've hired people whose parents were hiding from Ceausescu. I mean, I have firsthand information from people who understand what life was like under communism in the USSR, what it was like after the Berlin Wall fell, and what happened in the Balkans and how they broke apart. And some of them wound up with far worse leaders than they had before. But I've got that information, and when I hear people say, "Oh, well, let's do Mayor Mamdani and let's do communism in New York," no, you don't really want any of that. You really
No,
don't
it's an
want it.
amazing thing.
It's bad
And I
stuff.
think you point out a lot of interesting parts. The first thing when you started, I was thinking, farm has four letters, FARM, and if you mix them up, it almost is Marx, MARX. And if Karl Marx had spent some time on a farm, I think you'd have a different concept of communism, and he'd have written something different, or not at all. There's Paul Johnson, the late Paul Johnson, started out as a communist himself and became kind of a right-wing intellectual, and he wrote a book called
Right.
Intellectuals, as well as another couple of fabulous histories. I think Modern Times is one that was really kind of transformative for me. I recommend people, find that. But as you're speaking, a lot of things resonate with me because, the concept of liberal, liberal, the root word is freedom, liberty, and it was
Right.
applied to the Roman, the kids who were wealthy enough to go to kind of private tutors and whatnot. The concept was they needed to learn what was called the trivium and the I guess quadrivium, but we've kind of turned around the term trivium to be trivial, but those are the three essential parts. It was like reading, writing,
Right.
and rhetoric. And you can learn all those things, but they're not really tools in and of themselves. I remember learning some aspects of that. I went to a kind of a private high school and public school originally, and then private high school in New York City. And you learn some of that stuff, but then it's all just stuff. It's all just stuff you read on the
Yeah.
page. You know, you might read about the Carolingians or the Hanseatic League or something, you know, some piece of history, and it just doesn't really mean anything to me because, you know, I'd rather learn about, you know, I don't know, a baseball player or something like that, something that's more active and vivid in the imagination. But it's only till you kind of live these things out. And you don't necessarily live them out in a planned way. So the kind of the best liberal education, in a sense, is, I mean, you need to have that framework where you can maybe be receptive to different ideas, but some of them just kind of happen upon you and to you. Like I didn't plan
Yeah.
on being kind of any expert on the same aspects of East Europe and whatnot. But, you know, in 1987, lo and behold, I had some time between jobs and we were in Europe, and I just had bicycles there, and I did, you know, I thought it'd be really cool to go, you know, behind the Iron Curtain. So we bicycled through from Austria into Hungary and into Czechoslovakia, bits of East Germany and Yugoslavia, whatever. And so we, you know, that was a world that soon changed, fortunately, but people don't really have any conception of it. I got to meet people, you know, we stayed in certain people's homes and whatnot, you know, from the inside, as you're talking about with your friend, you know, Romanian friend and whatnot. And,
Right.
you know, that kind of experiential stuff, it just, you know, obviously happens to you. You can either get old or you can get knowledgeable and old. Hopefully those things, you know, experience translates into something useful. Because I think there's clearly a diminution. You know, I'm not quite as sharp as I used to be. You know, I had a better proclivity to pick things up and mop things up. As you're talking about being kind of knowledge based, you know, that was always my thing, you know, to kind of pick things up, knowledge, whatever. I don't know why. It's probably some kind of thing, you know, some kids join a rock band to be attractive, and other people are picking out, you know, other kind of talents they can. I'm not sure it was that, you know, conscious, but, you know, I think that, you know, you seem to have a, you know, experiential part and a knowledge-based part and ability to kind of pick things up and then, you know, rotate them around your head. You know, you can pick up a lot of rocks, but in order to get like a smooth marble, you know, there's a lot of kind of machinery that's involved. You have to bang them off each other before you get something that kids want to play with and that looks really cool. I mean, they're all just rocks. You know, almost everything we have around us. I had George Gilder on the show some time ago. Actually, I think he's been on 2 or 3 times. But, you know, he was talking about, you know, the things we have around us. I mean, right now we're talking through, you know, sand, using lightning. And his point is that, you know, you have a silicon-based computer, you know, silicon, you know, silica is sand. We're using electricity, that's lightning. You know, we have the same kind of basic characteristic items that people had maybe 10,000 or 100,000 years ago, but we've managed to formulate them and put them in different ways, and we think we're so much smarter. But, you know, a fair amount of that is obviously capitalizing in both senses of the word on experiential items that people, you know, I wouldn't know how to build a computer today, but, you know, you're building on other people's aspects. And the kind of Mamdanis of the world ignore that. The point you made about, you know, prices having different elements. You know, I was in New York, kind of in my own little rant here. I've been in New York. I grew up in New York City, but I don't go back that much. But I was there maybe 6-8 months ago, and an economist friend of mine, and I've been writing a fair amount on economics, although I'm as much an economist as you are, perhaps, i.e. not at all. But you know, we were just sitting talking. It was late on one evening, and New York City is a dense place. And everything that gets eaten on a given day, you know, there are millions of people, they're eating dozens of things over the course of the day. Every single one of those things essentially has to be replaced overnight or during the day. And it has to all come from someplace. It's not a single, speaking of farms, not a single farm in New York City worth any note. Maybe somebody has, you know, penthouse garden for tomatoes or whatever, but that's not going to sustain the place. So the entire city has to be replenished day after day because people have this nasty, nasty habit of continuing to eat. You know, that's one of the reasons I had to go to work. My kids were, you know, young and they insisted on eating food, and I had to like figure out a way to bring it home. But the whole city is an apparatus where it's a living, breathing thing in a sense, but its blood supply are these trucks and whatnot, which the Mamdanis of the world don't want. They want bike lanes. They want people not to be able to drive in the city. They want to close the roads off. And it's like the concept of like how you replenish the blood supply, literally the food supply of a city overnight, replenish it. I mean, it can go south so quickly. You know, I mean, you can turn it, you know, Mogadishu, I'm not sure when it was a functioning place, but, you know, in the 90s it wasn't. I'm not sure to what extent it is now. I was reading one of my other favorite writers, P.J. O'Rourke, on Mogadishu. And, you know, when he was there in 1992, everyone's just shooting each other. things can evolve, and they can revolve, and they can devolve. And so when people
Yeah.
want a revolution, it's turning from one thing to another. And as you mentioned, a lot of times the thing that comes next is not that great.
Yeah. Yeah. No, true. And if you if you've done, I mean, you probably have as a doctor gone through this and at least understand the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You can only climb that ladder one rung at a time, but you can fall down that ladder very quickly in multiple rungs at one time. And I think that's a lot of what people don't understand. I've spent a fair amount of time in Manhattan too because I work with a private equity firm. They own a company and I own part of the same company. And I was spent a lot of time in Manhattan reporting to the board of directors and there for meetings and everything else. And you're right. I was always amazed at the things that happen from midnight to say 4 a.m. in New York City. Because you're right, and I've never really thought about it that way, but it is a living, breathing organism that has to eat. And every night after everybody eats everything during the day, all of that food has to be replenished because it has to be ready to go at breakfast the next morning. And it's amazing to watch that actually happen. I mean, and the modes of transportation I found to be amazing. I looked up one day, and here comes a guy pulling an Amazon cart on an electric bike to deliver stuff within the city and the close-in city in there. And construction is everywhere. I mean, things have to be fixed. I mean, you got to fix water lines, you got to fix power. I mean, all this kind of stuff, and it's incredible this ballet, this dance of people that keep that city working. And I don't think the people who actually do keep it running actually get the credit that they really deserve. But these Pollyanna ideas of we can just go in and we can stop doing this because we don't like this anymore. We can stop doing this because it offends some person or some of this kind of stuff. And they really never ask the question. I mean, and it's something that I always use because when I'm talking to somebody, when I'm really trying to tease out what their real objectives are, I always ask questions. I'm a big fan of the Socratic method. And I'm always asking, okay, well, you're going to do that. Well, and then what? And then they give me the answer, and then what? And I keep pushing them until we get to a point where they either answer that question or they understand that there's a big gap in their knowledge and they're really leaving something out. And again, that drives a lot of what I'm doing right now too, as far as my writing, as far as a Pamphleteer project, as far as the other stuff, is I'm trying to help people answer that and what's next kind of question. And I want them to have, I've had the benefit of a lot of information shoved into my head, and it's, a lot of it's beginning to leak out now that I'm getting to a certain, I've reached that certain age, but there's still a good bit of it in there. And when I talk to people, I find out that I make assumptions about what people know based on what I know. And I've found out through some pretty difficult situations that that's not always true. I mean, even people my age don't know the things that I know because they haven't had the opportunities that I've had. So I really saw a gap there that I'm trying to help fill in some small way. And I mean, I know I've said I've got 34,000 followers, but on social media, I mean, you've got social media influencers that do nothing but look good and travel around the world that have 5-6 million followers. So it's not what I'm doing is barely scratching the surface, but I still think it's important. And Glenn Reynolds, he's the proprietor of Instapundit on online. It's a long running. I mean, one of the very first people who went online, 1,000 years ago, when we had stone tablets instead of computers. But he's a law professor at the University of Tennessee. But his point is that you never should stop learning. You never should stop driving forward. You should never assume that people know what you know because there's value in the things that you know because somebody may hear that. And what you were talking about the other earlier, you were describing innovation about taking common things like lightning and the stuff that silica and all the stuff that already exists and transforming it into something else that has more utility. And that comes through innovation and that comes through thinking. There's not a thing, I mean, there may be a couple of things that have happened by accident, but almost every 99.9% of the things that we enjoy right now started in somebody's head somewhere. I mean, it might not have been them. It might have been them having an idea that somebody else picked up on and they added something to it and they changed this and they moved this along. And then all of a sudden, from a pile of sand, you've actually got you've got a chip that you can imprint a circuit on that you can run a computer on. And now you and I are sitting here talking over the internet and sharing video over the internet. That's something just 10 years ago was almost virtually impossible because you just couldn't transmit that much data at one time. I mean, I've got 8 gigabit service coming into my house right now from Google Fiber. I mean, I'm talking to you basically over impulses of light waves. So, I mean, it's incredible what we've been able to do, and yet we seem to still stumble over the same stupid things that the Romans and the Greeks fought over, millennia ago, and we just don't seem to be able to get past those points sometimes.
Yeah, well, our hardware is old. We can try different software now and then, but we are wired a certain way. We have odor, we have fear, we have emotions, and obviously, those can be played well or poorly. And one of the big tragedies of COVID-19 is that how easily we're able to be formed into a kind of a blob of cowering people willing to be subservient. I mean, speaking of which, I don't want to get too polemic here, but the word Islam, I think, means literally submission. And so, there can be, I guess, maybe a certain amount of joy in submitting to something. Oftentimes people think they want to get wealthy and I don't know, buy a place in the Caribbean, buy a mansion on the top of a hill. But a fair amount of the greatest joy that people have is in a mosh pit. At a concert where they're a blob, where they're one of thousands. They're just doing exactly what everybody else does. They're yelling the same thing. They have their fists out. Now, I've been to my share of concerts one way or another, rock concerts and this and that. And, it's liberating not having to think, about stuff, you're not thinking about how you look, not thinking about, what you're wearing. You're just part of something, and that whole yell, you can like ride that wave. And that is obviously, something to be worried about because, the demos, the democracy can fail. Demos is the people, but the people, are they, atomized? Are they, thinking individually? Are they coming up with the base? You mentioned kind of the form of federalism we have. We have a government of 50 states, and ideally, they are going to come up with things individually and then compete against each other. So you kind of have this meritocracy of ideas. I don't know, even during COVID, there was North Dakota and South Dakota. They're almost identical. You could flip them on the map. If you could flip them geographically, they would probably fit in like a jigsaw puzzle, just the same. They were exactly the identical boxes filled with the same type of people, the same demographics, the same type of governorship, same kind of, government and whatnot. And yet one was doing lockdowns or school openings, which one they're diametrically opposite the other. And so, we have this ability to have experiments side by side. And when we kind of invert that concept of having a kind of informed populace, so the kind of classical liberal where you debate and have the rhetoric of whatever decide things, you have the mob. And the reason, people are doing this kind of short circuiting of thought, like an ice and having the, revolution part is that that is the thought that gets rid of thought. And that is, they're capitalizing on this kind of hardware issue that we have, that we feel more comfortable being in a group. I mean, there's obviously greater freedom being in the mob than being the one the mob's chasing after. I was watching an episode of Larry David's, or I was watching a clip, actually. I don't really watch episodes, but of Larry David, and he's a lefty. He has actually conservative sensibilities in the scripts he writes. I don't know if you ever read any of them or seen them. But almost every issue he comes up with is where he has an individual thought that's different. And he's kind of, figured out how people are conniving, people are cutting in line, people are kind of trying to use their certain privileges, and he's against that. So he's kind of, in a way, the conservative, the naysayer, the one who's pointing out fraud here and there. And at one point, he winds up making an agreement with another guy standing in line. They're pointlessly standing in line on an afternoon, a beautiful afternoon. They could do other things, and they're going to vote. And the guy in front of them is going to vote for the conservative, say, and he's going to vote for the liberal. And he said, you know what?
Right.
How about both of us don't vote, and we'll just walk away. Our vote's going to negate each other anyway. So he walks away, and the candidate winds up losing by a vote. Now, if Larry had voted and the other guy voted, it'd still be the same, still be the one vote. But the mob in this room. They're all waiting there. And, 80, 60 people at this party, they all come upon Larry David because somebody, rats him out. And they all come out just like, almost like pitchforks and whatnot. And obviously he lives till the next episode because he's the producer. But in real life, he wouldn't have. The mob would have made a decision, and the mob would have acted on it. And that is what the left is always looking for. The number of people, I think Archimedes said, give me a lever long enough and I will move the world. Well, you don't necessarily need that. You may just need a certain amount of activism at the right pressure points. And that has been the study of the left endlessly. And it's not liberalism. Hillary Clinton wrote her, I don't know, college, I don't know if it's a thesis or not, but I think her college thesis was on Saul Alinsky. And that is, right. That suffuses that realm. And they were kind of the moderate Democrats compared to the kind of the version we have now. Like I think Bill and Hillary, Hillary's probably left of Bill, whatever. But, that is, supposedly the moderate Democrats you would have had in the 90s, that kind of Clinton Gore fusion and whatnot. But they were suffused by that same aspect of, letting no crisis go to waste. That's Rahm Emanuel basically filtering Saul Alinsky, who's filtering all the Gramscian, kind of Herbert Marcuse, the Frankfurt School and whatnot, who are filtering from Marx and whatnot. It's all kind of down the same road. And before there was Marx, there were all kinds of pre-Marxian Marxists. They just didn't have that name.
Right.
And it's always been something where they want to short circuit the system because they are, frankly, ungainly, unkempt, unruly, and I guess unable to get things for themselves. So the best way to do it, kind of rape and pillage by proxy, is to overturn a government and then steal from them and then tax the hell out of it. And it winds up working for a short period of time until it doesn't, obviously.
Well, I mean, it's just like a con game. I mean, con games work until you're not getting enough people coming into the game to pay the people that you started with the game, and then the whole thing collapses. I mean, and in all honesty, that's kind of what we've got right now. I mean, we're $37 trillion in debt or something like that. More than that probably now. But, to your point earlier, life is a series of trade-offs. I mean, people ask me, okay, how do you define the difference between freedom and liberty? And my answer has always been that liberty, freedom is complete. You do whatever you want to, whenever you want to whoever you want to. Liberty is the difference between how much you give up to live in a civil society from your freedom to be able to live in that civil society. And that's liberty. That's what I consider liberty. But there's always a trade-off. I mean, you pay for something, for changes in government and through changes in politics, by giving up liberty. It may not cost you in dollars, but somehow, somewhere along the line, somebody's going to try to take a little bit more liberty from you. You either pay more taxes or you're restrained from doing a certain thing that you might have done in the past. There's always a cost for this kind of stuff, and people don't really understand that. And I just don't. I mean, I've always had that rugged individualist mindset. I mean, like I said, from growing up on a farm, you had things. My grandfather used to tell me sometimes you have to do things just because they need doing. And I've lived my life that way too. I've never shied away from doing things that needed to be done. And you get into a position where people think that they can avoid having to do the things that need to be done by being a member of a group. And that's another thing that's absolutely fascinated me. Group behavior, crowd behavior has always fascinated me, how crowds can be manipulated. And I found a book, this was, I don't know, 50 years ago, I guess. I was in college. And it's called The Crowd. I forget, I'm drawing a blank now, but it's a study of the popular mind. But it was written by a Frenchman by the name of Gustave Le Bon in 1895. And he sat down and described pretty much everything we see happening in politics and has happened in politics over the last 50 years in terms of crowd behavior and how sometimes a leader can co-opt a crowd for goals that the crowd never even had, but it was the goals of the leader to get these things accomplished. And he convinces the crowd that I think it was Friedrich Hayek said that the easiest way to get anything done, a collectivist gets anything done, is by making people believe that they always believe that way, that they always believe this thing. So there's a lot of that kind of crowd dynamic going on. And people, it seems kind of dull, but it's actually really interesting how crowds get motivated and how they form and how they break up and those kind of things. And it explains a lot about our current politics. And I think we're in, like I said earlier, we're in a period of manufactured chaos, but it's not chaos. It's purposeful chaos. There's forces at work within our political system, within our governmental system, within our social systems that are basically looking to overturn this country. I really believe that. And I don't mean, I'm not talking about fringe right wing. I'm a, prepper and I've got a basement full of ammunition. I mean, I've got a lot of ammunition, but I shoot. I've always been a shooter. But you just see it in a lot of the activities that are going on right now. It's like, I've had people that'll tell me, "Oh, well, we want to replace the system, the capitalist system, with this system, or this system, or this system." And I look at them and I say, "Okay, well, okay, again, back to the Socratic method. What's going to happen next? What are you going to replace it with?" And most of the people that I discuss these kind of things with have no earthly idea what they're going to replace it with, or that the replacement that they've actually picked is going to be a freaking disaster because it's already proven to have been a disaster. That's the other thing. Santayana said that people who don't understand history are condemned to repeat it, or I'm paraphrasing, of course. But that's what we've got going on now. People believe it'll be different because they want it to be different, not because it's going to be different. So we've got a lot of challenges to go through over the next few years. President Trump, I think, has done as much as he can do. I'm not. I posted this morning. I'm really kind of upset with the Republican Party because we're not doing the job that we need to get done. We're folding, or the Republicans are falling back into that old lovable loser, loyal opposition kind of position, and they're not being bold like they should be, because the times that we have right now are, I mean, for God's sake, you can't even get people to vote for a election integrity act. I mean, it's really nothing more than proving you're a citizen in order to be able to register to vote, to make sure the voting is clean. And like you were talking about, Larry David, if you have one person that vote is canceled out by somebody who shouldn't have been able to vote, then you've committed, I mean, basically we've committed a crime. And there's so many elections now. You see a lot of these elections. Our mayoral election here in Park City was won by 11 votes out of over 7,000 some odd votes that were cast in the city. It came down to basically between two friends of mine, Jack Rubin and a guy who used to be our manager of our homeowners association. Actually, there was 11 votes that separated the two, and after they counted the votes 3 times, there were still 11 votes that separated the two guys. So voting matters, and I don't know. There's a lot. There's just so much going on right now. You asked me how I pick subjects to write about. It's a target-rich environment, Randy. There's a lot of stuff out there going on right now that deserves a little bit of examination.
Yeah, I find that. I mean, I've had a Substack now since like the last spring, and I wind up, I don't have a quite the navigator sensibilities, but I mean, some of it's centered on medicine. Obviously, I'm a medical doctor, and so I've written on autism. I've written on ADHD and various medical issues, and but a lot of them are just kind of experiential. They're not per se politics, but one of my near neighbors was a guy who scratched one of the Teslas during the Tesla wars a year ago, and I wrote about that. And there are things that happen that it's kind of unavoidable to write on. I wrote about Woody Allen, and they're just things that come up to mind through conversation and whatnot. So it's good. I'm not quite as prolific, but it's kind of always been a good outlet. A lot of the plus side of social media thing for me over the years is that I used to maybe have more arguments at table, dinner parties and whatnot, because I grew up as a kind of a Democrat and a lefty, I guess, in New York City. But over time, reality hits, and the Ronald Reagan era was a huge kind of crucible experiment for a lot of people, perhaps. But I was in my 20s, and everyone had ridiculed, on my team had ridiculed Ronald Reagan as a moron. And okay, so even if, let's say, he's not as Harvardy as John Quincy Adams or something like that. What happened? I mean, what happened was the Soviet Union fell. People made fun of him for all kinds of his ideas, and the economy got better. We had this Reagan boom for decades. Bill Clinton basically was wafting in the afterflow of the Reagan Revolution, and it's like, well, how do you put that stuff down? I started picking up the Wall Street Journal in college only by accident because my roommate had a free subscription. It was paper back then. People may not realize what paper is. It's kind of, I've been using this as this little thing here. But they used to put words.
They used to throw those things in your driveway in the morning. You go out and pick them up and read them.
They used to put words on it, pictures. I mean, it's kind of hard to believe. I don't know how they did the technology back then. We think they must have been primitive, but somehow they were able to not only put words on it, but do it day by day, a little bit like feeding New York every night. So they would put words on these pieces of paper, and they were even thinner than this and more regular. And then they throw it in your yard, and if it didn't rain, you'd be able to read it the next day. Anyway, I used to get the Wall Street Journal for free, and then when I went to medical school, my roommate had no interest in it. I just asked if I could carry it through, and I just made his name care of my name up in Rochester, and I kept it going for like a long time. They just never knew, but it did kind of like it's speaking of the Socratic method. As a lefty hanging around in college, I was at Yale with a whole bunch of lefties. I didn't really realize it, whatever, kind of the monochromatic aspect of your education. But there were occasional non-left lecturers, and that in the Wall Street Journal, I started to do that Socratic thing in my head. It was like, okay, we think this. We think there should be increasing minimum wage all the time. We should stop drilling for oil. We think we should do this. We should, and I'd read stuff there, and it's like, and then over time, because I was doing a whole bunch of other stuff, I kind of had the time to let the experiment flow because I'm so busy in medical school. I didn't have a political thought really at all. I don't think it was enough to wake up in the morning, having been up all night, whatever. It's a lot of, they put you through a lot of kind of like military level boot camp kind of training. And so when I kind of had the ability to stop and think about stuff, years, after residency, whatnot, a lot of that stuff filtered in. It's like, okay, well, we've been through the Reagan years and now it's still the 80s or whatever. And, what's going on? What happened? And it's like, I had to, admit that things were far better from having had Ronald Reagan than, from probably having had Walter Mondale or whoever. And it's like, or Jimmy Carter continued and whatever. And it's like, I don't think people do that kind of side-by-side experiment. And just one other side point that you brought up through the multi-country viewpoint is that I wrote an article that got a lot of pickup because Dr. Robert Malone picked it up on autism. And everyone's got, this big autism epidemic. And everyone's like, oh my God, we got to do X, Y, and Z because of this autism epidemic. And I like to look at first principles. I'm like, okay, it's an autism epidemic. What is autism? And what part of it's an epidemic? Has this been always the same thing we're calling autism? Or, and what is going on with it? So I wrote this kind of ground zero, when I say, I don't mean first principles, I guess would be a better term, article. And I spent like 9 weeks just doing that. So I didn't write any much else. And I spent all my time reviewing and reserving my time for that. And I was doing other things. I got a real estate thing going, I'm working and whatnot, part-time. And so here and there, but every other waking hour, I was coming up with that. But one of the things along the way that really struck me was, okay, we are having an autism epidemic. Is China having an autism epidemic? Is India having an autism? Is who else is having this thing? If it's that bad, if it's vaccines or whatever, other places get vaccines. Okay, maybe they don't get quite the number we do, but all through Europe they get probably a good half of what we get. And other countries, whatever, they're getting their fair share of whatever. And there are other places that have more intoxicants, than we do. I'm sure there's a lot of slums, a lot of places on Earth that have air worse than, stuff in their food worse than we have. And are they getting an autism today? And the answer pretty much across the board is no. No. They don't even if you look at literature, they don't even mention the word autism in Africa. Now, South Africa is a little bit different, whatever. But all pretty much from Cairo to Casablanca down to, I don't know, you pick Kinshasa or whatever, there's no autism. And that's not even something people talk about because they got other things on their plate. They're worrying about tuberculosis, malaria, and whatnot. But even if they did have that classification, would it be the same? And so how much of this is cultural, whatever. But we're, a lot of people are willing to upend the entire society and do everything based on, certain facts in their mind, which may not be. And so,
Yeah.
It's kind of like that level of what you call, I used to call it Socratic. My attorney called it Bacratic because he was toying with me, that because he was my patient also, and he's still alive. I didn't kill him, but he used to call it the Bacratic method because medicine, I would treat things medically the same way. You have to kind of go through the whole list of things and try not to miss anything. And I was always a big fan of Sherlock Holmes, and he was Conan Doyle was a physician. But one of the things that Holmes says is, whatever remains after everything else has been eliminated, however improbable, must be the truth. So you kind of have to work and peel the layers off in order to get at the truth. And then if you want your mom to do something, you got to be honest and feed them the right stuff. There's so many easy ways to dupe people that it's sad. Anyway, we're kind of rounding out the hour, and I'm wondering whether you have any further wisdom. You've had a fair amount of it on the wisdomometer. I'll give you like 95 or so.
No, I would say that one of the other things that I do in conjunction with the Socratic method too, and it's a sort of a self-interrogation. Anytime I get ready to write something down and I go through it and I take a step back and take a look at it, I always ask the question of myself: what if I'm wrong? What are people seeing from the other side? And that helps me really understand and gives me confidence to go forward with what I'm writing, because I don't always finish with what I started with, because I do find out that there's a potential that I could be wrong, and I don't want to do that. And again, every time I express an opinion, I actually state that this is my opinion. I'm not telling you this is a fact. You have to make decisions on your own. But I try to look at something from 3 or 4 different dimensions to try to figure out what other angle is it there that I'm missing, because I'm one person and I talk to a lot of people and I call people and talk to them about things, and I try to figure out, is this the right, even if I'm not precisely correct, am I directionally correct? So that would be one of the things, and just a real quick aside, I was asked the other day about my advice for new writers. And my advice to them was, or this particular person, I said, if you feel pressure to write about something, you're writing about the wrong thing. Because if you don't believe it, and if it doesn't bring you enjoyment, if it doesn't bring you fulfillment, it's not something you should be worried about, because it's the wrong thing to write about. So that, I'll leave it with that. It's been an interesting journey so far. I look forward to continuing it, and hopefully I'll get better. I think I've grown a lot in the last couple of years as an author and a writer. I've got 2 more books that I'm trying to get written in between. So I'm having a good time. Let me put it that way. I'm having a good time right now.
Well, I had a good time. People can find you at Unlicensed Punditry.
Punditry
on Substack.
Yeah. It's the site is michaelsmith.substack.com if people want to go find it that way, but you can find it by looking it up as Unlicensed Punditry.
Well, it's been my joy and pleasure having you on. I learned so much reading your stuff, and it's been years. I got to get a signed copy of your book when it comes out, hopefully.
I will send it to you.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much.